Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our journal club on the science of diversity in orthopedic surgery, put on by the International Orthopedic Diversity Alliance. My name is Zach Lum. I'm the assistant professor of orthopedic surgery at University of California, Davis, and fortunate enough to be the IODA North American representative, along with my colleague and co-representative, Dr. Marc Tompkins. Marc?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining tonight. I am professor of orthopedic surgery at the University of Minnesota. And as Zach said, I'm fortunate to be part of IODA, sharing a role with Zach. And as part of that, we get to help try to organize these webinars to discuss articles. And tonight we're very fortunate to have a guest presenter who I have gotten to know for a long time. I've been fortunate enough to work with Dr. Anne Van Heest for a long time and see all of the work that she's doing, and I've been able to do it up close and personal. So I can attest to all the things that she has contributed. And Zach is going to do a formal introduction for her.
Thanks so much, Marc. Yes, we're really, truly honored to have Dr. Anne Van Heest with us this evening. Dr. Van Heest is the professor of orthopedic surgery and vice chair of education at the University of Minnesota, where she has been a major leader in resident education, competency-based surgical training, and mentorship. She's also a nationally recognized and internationally recognized hand and upper extremity surgeon with clinical and academic expertise in pediatric and congenital upper extremity conditions. Beyond her clinical and educational leadership, Dr. Van Heest has been one of the most important national voices in understanding and addressing the lack of diversity in orthopedic surgery. She has helped move conversations beyond opinion and into a more rigorous framework. Where does the pipeline narrow? What barriers are structural or cultural? What interventions actually work? And how do we create an orthopedic environment where talented people not only enter the field, but can thrive? This makes tonight's discussion especially meaningful. The articles that we are reviewing highlight diversity in orthopedics from many different angles, the global scope of the problem, the barriers that exist across countries and training systems, and the measurable impact of sustained outreach and mentorship efforts such as the PERI Initiative. Dr. Van Heest is a co-author of the PERI Initiative study, which modeled how sustained exposure and mentorship efforts may contribute to increasing the population of women entering orthopedic residency and over time, therefore, the practicing orthopedic workforce. Dr. Van Heest has also served as a major leader in organized orthopedics, such as the president of the American Orthopedic Association, where she has emphasized leadership, mentorship, education, and importance of building a profession that better reflects the patients and the communities we serve. So tonight, as our residents present these articles, I think we can, I hope that we can think beyond representation alone. We should ask, what does the evidence show? Where can and what can departments actually change? What are the responsibilities of residents, faculty, leaders, and professional societies? And how can diversity become part of excellence in orthopedic surgery rather than a separate conversation? Dr. Van Heest, thank you for joining us and helping guide this important discussion.
Thank you, Zach, and thank you, Marc, and everyone who's part of this webinar. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I think this kind of dialogue is really what helps us move forward, not only in the United States, but across the world as we share many common problems, as we'll hear tonight from the articles that we'll be discussing.
Thank you so much. With the first article that we will be discussing, I'd like to introduce Dago Pina, one of our orthopedic residents, PGY now 3 at University of California, Davis. And he will be leading the article titled Diversity in Orthopedic Surgery, International Perspectives.
Thank you, Dr. Lum. Like I said, I'm Dagoberto Pina, one of the PGY theories here at UC Davis, and I'll be presenting the article titled Diversity in Orthopedic Surgery and International Perspectives. This article was written by the Carousel group, which includes presidents from major English-speaking organizations. The English-speaking countries mentioned in this article include Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, the UK, or the United Kingdom, and also the United States. It should be noted that this article was published in the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery, which I'll for now on reference as JBJS, as we all know, which is a high-impact journal with the intent to start a significant amount of discourse with respect to the issues in diversity with respect to orthopedic surgery throughout the globe. But with respect to the level of evidence, it's kind of at the bottom of the evidence pyramid as far as with a level 5 category. With that being said, the purpose of this article is to describe the diversity across the globe in the field of orthopedics. As we all know, within the United States, there is a lack of diversity with respect to the orthopedic surgeons, in respect to the differences in orthopedic surgeons and the discrepancy within the populations that we aim to serve. And we want to just describe whether or not this was also a global pattern. Overall, it hasn't very been well documented with respect to other countries as far as documenting in databases, tracking racial, ethnic, and sexual differences amongst different trainees in the various English-speaking countries I mentioned beforehand. This ultimately wasn't a study. This is more of a narrative piece written by the aforementioned authors, meaning that there was no original data. This was all pulled from each country's respective national databases. Amongst these, in the United States, we utilized the ACGME resident composition data, specifically looking at the years of 1998, 2007, and 2017. The Australian Bureau of Statistics was utilized, the New Zealand Medical Council workforce surveys, in addition to others. Overall, these large databases were appropriate means for collecting descriptive data, which were referenced by the authors, and ultimately aiming to report the different distributions, the different proportions of women and minorities in their respective orthopedic fields, hoping to address what are potential barriers and trying to note either increasing or decreasing trends in minorities within orthopedic surgery in their respective countries. Here we see a table where I aimed to summarize the overall findings. On the left-hand side in the first grade column, you'll notice the different countries that were mentioned in the article. And in the top row, you'll find the different variables that they aimed to describe. Amongst them, what you'll see is in all of the different countries, the underrepresented groups all included women. In all of the reported statistics, women represented a significant minority group within orthopedic surgery. Amongst them were Native individuals to the land, in addition to, well, either in the United States or other countries like South Africa or the United Kingdom, Black individuals. It should be noted that for the most part, women do compose a majority of the attendance of medical school throughout all of these different countries. However, when it comes to surgical specialties like orthopedic surgery, they comprise a small percentage of the actively practicing physicians. And within the United Kingdom, they also noted that after the first 4 years of medical training, there is a significant steep drop-off, resulting in lower amounts of women within the actual consultant or practicing orthopedic physicians. There's also noted to be key barriers throughout all the countries, and a similar reported phenomenon was that there was lack of mentorship that can potentially be expanded to include lack of early exposure, lack of guidance, and poor work conditions that tend to favor men more than women as well. Overall, these are pretty clear results that they summarize, and there doesn't appear to be any overt bias being reported by any of the providers. But what we can see on some of these results is that there's a small increase in the amount of women and minorities in orthopedic surgery throughout the past decades. But again, these are small differences. When it comes to evaluating some of this data, It should be noted that this is a narrative piece, so there's a good amount of generalizability with this. The overall aim was to see if scarce diversity patterns were seen across the globe, which they are, which definitely does increase the generalizability of this piece. Narrative pieces aren't actual studies in the sense that they're not diagnostic or systematic reviews, so they don't really apply to Leopold's framework when it comes to assessing a peer-reviewed article, but it does equate to about a level 5 evidence study. And in this case, as I mentioned earlier, no original data was proposed, and they were all pulled from sources such as national databases. Overall conclusions with respect to the article is that in orthopedics, the diversity gap is not just a United States phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon, in particular in the aforementioned English-speaking countries. Medical schools, for example, are trending towards a more predominant female majority in classes. This was reported in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. And there's also an increasing effort to increase minority groups within medical school admissions, as was reported by, for example, the non-competitive admitted yet also qualified applicants within Australia and New Zealand. There also are barriers that prevent minorities and women from entering the field. And as noted earlier, in some of the countries such as the United Kingdom, South Africa, and the United States that have a well-known history of segregation and discrimination, it should be noted that potentially some of these barriers are actually more specialty specific as opposed to institutional socioeconomic barriers that are still existing. This was implied when you look at the different countries that I mentioned earlier, and how some of these countries, like for example, New Zealand, have a low proportion of females practicing in orthopedic surgery. However, when you assess other surgical subspecialties, they do have higher proportions of women and minorities actively practicing as well. In the study, there's a table number 2, that shows that in the United States, general surgery residents throughout the years have an increased proportion of females. In 2017, 50% of the general surgery residents were made up by women. However, this is not an increasing trend that we see in orthopedics. So therefore, while we are increasing the proportion of women and minorities in other fields, we don't seem to see those similar trends in orthopedic surgery. Other things to note is that there are early interventions that do show some promise, such as interventions Australia's 5-year diversity strategy and New Zealand's Whispering Workshop, that are aiming to increase the diversity within orthopedic surgery. From an anecdotal standpoint, I myself was a part of interventions, and I do believe that it definitely did help me matriculate into orthopedic surgery. But with that being said, overall, we know that there's a large discrepancy with respect to the representation in orthopedic surgeries and the proportional to the community that they serve. So my one question that I may have for the panelists is, what are some efforts at your institutions that are being implemented or in the works to help address some of these diversity discrepancies that we're seeing? Thank you.
Dago, very nice job. I really appreciate that. I think that's a great introduction article to kind of describe the overall climate or pulse of diversity in globally in the world. And I think that's one of the unique aspects that our organization has. And selfishly for me also to learn about some of the challenges other countries, other areas of the world have regarding these things. I guess, for us entailed, usually, we have at University of California, Davis, we have certain programs that, such as actually Perry and that we support on an annual basis. But the question always is maybe how we can do more and how is it going? So.
I'll give a little bit of a commentary on this paper as well. And thank you, Dago. That was a really nice summary of the paper. And I really liked your table that showed all the different countries and just the commonalities that we all have despite our different cultures and our different geographic settings. In full disclosure, I was an AOA president and was part of the Carousel Travels in 2023. And one of the things that I was struck by, this article was written in 2018, I believe, and led by Sandy Emery, who was the president at that time. And it was primarily white males that were president at that time. And there was a lot of interest in by that group in trying to increase the diversity. So as you mentioned, there are 5 Carousel countries. Each of those countries has now had a female president of their association. So I was the second president of the AOA, the American Orthopaedic Association, second female, 189th president. And we now have the third female in line. I think if I look at our webinar attendees, it looks like Christy Weber is online. She was the first Academy female president. It looks like Lori Heemstra is online. I traveled with her. Hi, Lori. And she was the first Canadian Orthopaedic Association president. Australia and New Zealand have both had female orthopedic presidents. And most recently, South Africa, Odette Koch has been this year's president. So that is the 5th so all Carousel countries have now had females in their presidential position. So I think that that's really important when you talk about these different barriers. One of the things that always comes up is top down. Like, do we have females in leadership positions and females as examples and mentors and role models for younger orthopedic surgeons? And as we traveled the world, both Dr. Heemstra and I particularly, and Deb Eastwood, who's also part of IODA, we all traveled together. And we were often invited to the female orthopedic surgery groups in each of these 5 countries. And they are quite different in size. Some countries struggle more with this than other countries, but it is a common thread across all countries, and all countries are looking for similar ways to address the barriers.
Hey, Anne, one of the things I might chime in and ask you to comment on, I'm not sure how many of the folks on the call know that you recently retired. So you have been watching this process for a long time. So to your comments about from a global scale, as your role in a lot of leadership possibilities or opportunities, do you feel like you have seen changes on a global scale? I know that you have been involved yourself and have seen changes on a national scale here in the US, but on a global scale, do you feel that you have been able to witness changes and maybe highlight what you feel like you've witnessed?
Yeah, that's a great point, Marc. I mean, I think even just starting with the presidential line, previously when this article was written, all of the presidents were male. And as of this year, all of the societies have had female presidents. So that's really an international progress. I think some countries, like I said, our AOA is on its 3rd female president. Our AAOS has a 2nd female president in the presidential line. The BOA has had 2. Deb Eastwood was the 2nd female president. So certainly different people are at different organizations are at a little bit different stages. The other thing that is struck me when I was in some of the other countries is when countries have nationalized training programs, it oftentimes is more centrally controlled. So, for example, in the United States, we do have the ACGME and the ABOS, but in countries such as England, where they have the NHS, and in Australia, where they have the Royal College, obviously the Royal College is also in the United Kingdom, there's much more centralized control of trainees. So, for example, I believe that in Australia, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not the world's expert on every country's selection process, but I believe they have a centralized selection process. So in the United States, we have 208 programs, and 208 programs each run their own residency interviews and selection process, whereas in many of these countries, there's a single selection process, and then you get distributed to the different training sites. So if you want to, for example, change your selection process or make sure that you have representation on your selection committee, you can do that at a single place because there's a single selection committee. That can work both ways. If you have a selection committee that has significant bias or implicit bias by some of the members of that committee, there's only one committee that controls that for the country. So there are different challenges in different countries as we try to increase the pipeline of females and underrepresented in medicine, racial and ethnic groups. There are different challenges in different countries merely based on the sheer size of the country. I think Canada has about 17 either medical schools or programs. Lori, you can chime in the chat if I got that wrong, but they're much more centralized than having 208 programs like we have here in the United States. So certainly we've seen progress, but in the United States, for example, we see a lot of different progress at different residency programs. Some residency programs train very high numbers of women and underrepresented minorities, and some programs, there are still 12 programs in the United States of America in 2026 that have no women. So it's still continues to be an issue in certain programs in the United States.
Thank you for all that perspective, Anne. We do have one question in the chat. And by the way, Lori said 17 programs in Canada. From Stuart Proper, the question is, if our aim is to increase diversity through equality of opportunity rather than equality of outcome, what data do we have as to where the blocks to increasing diversity are occurring? Do you have any thoughts on that, Anne?
I think we'll get more into that in some of the later articles, certainly the third article. But the biggest block, as Dago showed here in this article, is almost half of the medical students are women. So for gender, there is not as big an issue getting into medical school. The constriction point in the pipeline is medical students choosing orthopedics. For many of the different racial groups, it's more of a block getting represented individuals into medical school, meaning the represented, like the Maori people, for example, in New Zealand. I believe they're like 16% of the population, and they're trying to have a 16% representation or such in the medical schools. So that's been a challenge to try to get that same representation as your population within your medical school. So for the racial and ethnic groups in general, it's been getting individuals into medical school. For the gender issue, it's primarily been a blockage getting medical students to choose orthopedics as a subspecialty.
Thanks a lot, Anne. I think in the interest of time, we'll move on to our next article. And so I get to introduce Arthur Onley, who is one of our illustrious now chief residents at the University of Minnesota. And for all of us in sports medicine, we're fortunate that Arthur has chosen sports medicine, and he will do a fellowship next year. So he is going to present on the article, Overcoming the Barriers to Diversity in Orthopedic Surgery, a Global Perspective, which came from the Orthopedic Forum in JBJS. Thanks, Arthur.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity. We'll go ahead and jump in. So to get started, in preparation for this, I just typed into a ChatGPT and wanted to see what they would construct as far as an image representing orthopedic surgery resident. And this is what they generated. This gentleman actually looks very similar to one of my co-residents. And I mean, this is kind of that general representation that the specialty has for most people. And we do realize that this is not necessarily representative of the communities we serve. We treat a variety of patients from a variety of different cultures, and thus we want to have a field that is reflective of that. And what this article did was it looked at that disparity in representation as far as orthopedic surgeons, people that are going into orthopedic surgery, compared to the communities they represented. And they looked at this on a global scale, looking at not just the United States, but multiple countries such as the UK, New Zealand, to name a few. And this was a literary review of articles found through utilization of Medline and Embase. This was published in 2023. This was actually born out of a discussion with the president of IODA during that time with Dr. Weber, where they were discussing this on a podcast. And this led to them doing this literary review to look at different articles that had any kind of interest or study into diversity in orthopedics and any related terms to that. For inclusion, articles were included as long as they had English version available, and there was no time of publication that was used as a cutoff. The articles were initially screened just by the abstracts, the titles, and references, and then upon collection of the group of articles, they were further investigated by a full article review. This is one of the tables that was in the manuscript, and it just highlights the different kind of articles that were included. There was a total of 62 articles that made inclusion to this literary review. 8 of them were editorial, 15 were survey, 16 were narrative reviews of studies, and then 17 were cross-sectional studies. 4 were letters, 1 group study, and then there was 1 cohort case control study that was included. The bulk of this paper delved into the results and that they found through this review. Oh, sorry. An absence of diversity exists between the medical school graduates and orthopedic surgeons. In 2022, they found that 50% of graduating medical students were female, but only 18% were orthopedic residents that were classified as female. And this showed that there was a variance as far as the people that are going into medical school. There's an increase in the number of female representation, but the number of applicants lags behind. And then they also saw that despite continued growth in the female and minority representation, that this just was not seen in orthopedics as it had been seen in other specialties. In particular, as far as the minority represented groups, African Americans and Hispanic Americans only had 9 to 10% medical school matriculants, and that then was only reflective of about 6 to 7% representation in orthopedics as residents. As far as other countries, the United Kingdom also had a lower representation of orthopedic residents of color and of female representation. Again, that was also seen in New Zealand, Australia, South Africa. The Bernese population was one of the ones that had, they were leading the world regarding the portion of orthopedic surgeons who were female with a rate of 13.3. So they did establish that this is a community that's figured out a way to get that representation. As I stated, one of the major things that they identified in this paper was the concept of the perceived fit. And they delved into, when we're doing our selection, are there barriers to getting patients of different cultures, different genders, and having them feel like they can be a contributing member to the group and thus not alienated or unique in that they can't find their niche within the group, and does that make them feel isolated? As far as the discussion, when I took mostly from the robust amount of data that they had collected was the identification of, is orthopedic surgery an attractive specialty for the general, like, minority applicant or a female applicant? And then we have identified these different structural, cultural barriers. Is this a boys' club? Is orthopedics too stringent in constructs as far as being able to engage in other valuable experiences in life due to the inflexibility of training, the duration of training, the length and hours, etc., and what things are modifiable. The boys' club stereotype that is very common when discussing orthopedic surgery is something that I think that is a modifiable or correctable barrier, as opposed to some of the, like, the training aspects, the length of time, the duration of training. Those are some parts that are kind of necessary so that we are training applicants to become competent orthopedic surgeons. But are we now acknowledging that the sacrifice and the contribution that we are asking our applicants, our residents, to commit to, that now we've constructed cultures where they're going to be supported and they're going to be nurtured so that they can be successful? That, to me, one of the acronyms that I was unfamiliar with was the excuse me, sorry, the it was HDBS, the discrimination, the harassment, bullying. Those are things that unfortunately do occur in our field, and that's something that we as a group need to kind of, if it's a top down, bottom up, I think all parties that are involved in optimizing the representation of our field and contributing to providing a workforce that's representative of the communities that we treat, we all can contribute to eliminating those variables so that everybody feels supported, everybody is able to contribute and help patients. As far as this article, I thought it revealed that this is a global issue, as stated, and that also there are opportunities to implement the different initiatives that have been established through trying to increase representation, that we just continue to need to reinforce and contribute to finding leaders, supporting applicants, getting people exposure early, and then continually to nurture and cultivate that drive to go into orthopedics through their course of training. This was a literary review, not a systematic review. It was a level 7 evidence. As far as the major conclusions, as I stated, this is a global problem, and thus a global initiative is necessary. There are structural and cultural barriers that exist, and I do believe that several of these are modifiable and correctable barriers that, when we all work together through leadership at the top and then supporting from a bottom up, as far as contributing to our applicants and presenting orthopedics as a viable option, that they would be well supported and encouraged to contribute their medical training to treating patients. I think that's what's going to lead to that multifaceted strategy to improve diversity and overall improve patient care. Thank you.
Anne or Zach, would you like to follow on with Arthur and comment?
Sure, Arthur. Thank you very much. That was really a great synopsis of a lot of information. Again, I think we see some common themes to the first article that was presented, as far as that this is a global issue. And so I think that your synopsis of the ways that we can work on this in a multifaceted way. If I can share my screen for just a second. I have all of the articles. I thought this, can you see this figure 1 from the article? where it talks
Yes.
about barriers in medical school, the barriers in residency, and the barriers for consultants or attendees. And again, I just think this is something like at every level, people can, as you said, Arthur, it's a multifaceted problem. And, it's barriers to entry in medical school and outreach programs. And then once in training, making an inclusive culture that's safe for everyone. And as you said, an attractive specialty. And then for the consulting and attendings, the top-down commitment to diversity and getting representation from all of the different groups. So again, just to follow up on what I said previously, as Laura Heemstra pointed out, there is a second COA president, female president now in the presidential line as well. So I think we are seeing globally kind of a top-down leadership representation of female leaders. But I really like this multifaceted approach that this article brought about what we can do at the medical school level, at the resident level, and then at the institutional level.
Yeah, I agree. This article is very nice. It really highlighted comprehensively all the different, I guess, challenges that we have to overcome. One of the ones that I thought was meaningful was I didn't realize, this is a challenge not only in orthopedic surgery, but in business and multiple other fields not even related to medicine. And so some of the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies that are women have repeatedly said that one of the things that can really improve culture is if you have critical mass of individuals within that company or organization. And I think that number I hear is around 30% or 25%. And I think that's really when, that's a good number. Maybe that's a little bit easier than obviously achieving 50% or 51%. But that's a nice number to kind of maybe a goal to aspire to. So that's something that I've always had in my head. Fortunate at our organization at Davis, we have a fair number of women faculty, and we actually have a meeting. It's usually every October, the UC Ortho Women meeting, and that one's really great. And so I think it's really good to kind of get people together and not only network, but connect on so many different levels. So very, very honored to have that in our organization. But yeah, I think changing the culture comes from so many different ways, and it's very important to have that. So
one thing I might add to build on what you were just saying, Zach, is I think in terms of changing the culture, obviously education is a key part of that. I thought that one of the most particularly interesting parts about this article was that figure on all of the journals that had contributed articles to studying diversity. And if you look carefully at that, there are only a couple of the journals that have more than one. Good job, JBJS, since JBJS is supporting us with this. I'll highlight that. But mostly general journals like JBJS and Core, and then there's some institutional journals. So one of the things I would say in particular, at least in the US, but I know that this is happening in other countries as well, the reality is that a lot of us on the academic side are tending more towards our subspecialty areas. I would say based on what we saw in the journals that are reflected here, our subspecialty areas could certainly do more emphasis on this in our journals that I think would hopefully help with education as well, for whatever that's worth. One thing that I observed with that article. Doesn't look like, I'll just say to the attendees, if you have any questions, as has been done before, please put them in the Q&A. I'm happy to ask them across the panel. Otherwise, I think it's 8:40, so we can move into our last article. And with that, I'm fortunate to introduce Lily Chen. We were fortunate at the University of Minnesota to have Lily with us for her medical school. But now she has decided to go down the road, and she's a first-year resident at Mayo Clinic. And so she is going to present on the final article. And obviously, we have been talking about there are many places for opportunities for improvement. And this is an article that actually talks about how there is some evidence and there are strategies to do that. So Lily will talk about the impact of sustained outreach efforts on gender diversity in orthopedic surgery. Thank you, Lily.
Thank you, Dr. Tompkins. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and present on this article. I was very fortunate to be a recent graduate from the University of Minnesota Medical School, where I met a lot of incredible and inspiring mentors like Dr. Van Heest, Dr. Tompkins, and Dr. Only. The article I'm presenting on today is titled "The Impact of Sustained Outreach Efforts on Gender Diversity in Orthopedic Surgery." The authors and their affiliations are listed on this slide. This article was published in 2025 in JBJS. So this study utilized mathematical modeling to estimate the historical and projected impact of sustained outreach and mentoring programs on increasing the proportion of women entering and practicing orthopedic surgery. The model combined published data on program outreach along with AAMC and AOS census data to forecast gender diversity trends in PGY1 classes, as well as the practicing orthopedic workforce. No prior study has quantitatively modeled the long-term workforce level impacts of these efforts on the field's gender composition. And so this study fills that gap by projecting how current interventions translate into future workforce demographics. So the mathematical model utilized data from the Perry Initiative, AAMC, AOS, and some of the key inputs are shown in Table 2. The article does acknowledge that the model relies heavily on a single organization data as a proxy for all outreach efforts, which may not fully capture the landscape of all the diversity of initiatives. The model also assumes continued intervention at the current levels, which may not hold given changes in funding, political climate, or institutional policies. Some of the key results of this article include the proportion of women in the PGY1 orthopedic residency population increased from 14.7% to 20.9% between 2008 and 2022, which the model attributes at least partially to outreach efforts. Assuming the continued intervention at current levels, the PGY1 class is projected to reach a peak of 28% by 2028. Furthermore, the practicing orthopedic surgeon workforce is projected to reach a steady state of approximately 25% by 2055, and it is projected to approach but not fully reach the 30% critical mass threshold. The article also shared data regarding the Perry Initiative that it has reached over 12,000 women in high school and medical school, with over 20% of medical student participants matching into orthopedic surgery successfully. So some things to consider when reading this article include that multiple authors are organizers of the Perry Initiative, which represents a potential conflict of interest, as the study's conclusions directly validate the organization's mission. However, this does not invalidate the findings, but should be weighed in interpretation. Furthermore, the model attributes observed increase in women residents at least partially to outreach efforts, but as we've shared previously, this could also be due to concurrent factors such as changing medical school demographics or cultural shifts in other diversity initiatives. While this study does not directly change clinical practice, it has important implications for workforce policy and educational programming in orthopedic surgery. It provides quantitative support for continued investment in outreach programs, though the projections suggest that even with sustained effort, the field will fall short of the 30% critical mass threshold. In conclusion, sustained outreach programs like the Perry Initiative appear to be contributing to measurable increases in women entering orthopedic surgery residency. The study also highlights that national level interventions involving women at a large scale are needed to account for the quote-unquote leakage from the pipeline. Finally, a question for discussion. Given that the authors project the field will plateau at about 25% women, what additional interventions could the orthopedic community consider to move beyond the projected plateau?
And this is sort of a softball for you. This is why we highlighted this article and you tonight. So do you want to give your insights and experience from as you researched or was part of the research team for this article?
Sure. And Lily, I appreciate very much your summary of that article, and particularly that you pointed out the conflict of interest. I think that's always really important to know the sources from which they came. By full disclosure, I am on the Perry Board of Directors and have been since 2015. On our webinar, we also have Christy Weber, who is the chair of the board, and Dr. Janae McKee, who is one of the other members of the board. So certainly there is bias. I also would like to strongly acknowledge Dr. Jenny Buckley and Dr. Lisa Lattanza, as they are the two originators of the Perry Initiative, which was named after Dr. Jacqueline Perry and her efforts in increasing gender equity within orthopedic surgery. So with those disclosures, I think the origin of this article was actually a discussion where it just is, in some ways, becomes kind of simple, like do the math. Okay, just do the math. There's about 850 new orthopedic residents every year. About 850 orthopedic residents graduate every year. It's when you look at the charts, there's one particular table that's particularly good. I think table number 1, and I can just briefly share that just to make sure everyone can see. But here's table number 1. This is the number of people in residencies in PGY 1 year. There's 862 originally, there were 600. So it's grown as we've taken on the DO programs. If you're going to have 30% women, then you need to have 30% of 862 interns be women, which is 250 women a year. And so if you look at the number of Perry that are enrolled in MSOP in the second to the last column, we've been increasing. We started in 2012 and trying to increase the exposure to medical students. And the last reported year here was 745. And about a third of students who go through the Perry program ultimately match. This has 79 listed, but it is the express strategic plan of Perry to introduce orthopedic surgeons to MS1 and MS2 students that orthopedic surgery is an option. And when we look at these barriers across all the countries and all the articles we've read, one of the major barriers is getting medical students interested and having them understand that we are an attractive specialty. And so it's a program that's meant to be a spark, and it's not meant to be a full mentorship program. It's meant to spark the interest and then allow these very talented medical students to go out and further research orthopedic surgery and find out if that's the career for them. So as you pointed out, there's a number of kind of holes in the model. And that is, exactly how many people who do the program go on to match. I think they do need continued mentorship. This is meant to be a spark program. If you need to get 250 females into orthopedic surgery, that means you need to have over 750 medical students every year involved in your program. So this is so if you look at other programs, Nth Dimension, I'll just use as one, it's a smaller volume of people, and it's great to get 10 or 15 or 20 individuals into ortho, but we need 200. We need 250. We need 300 people. So this is meant to be a large-scale program at multiple sites across the United States and multiple medical students, again, just to light the spark and say, you too could be an orthopedic surgeon, and the word orthopedics isn't just about your mattress or about your shoes, it's an actual specialty, and it's a great specialty, and here's other women who have done this specialty. And again, we are continuing to try to branch out to other race and ethnicities as well. It's still a women's organization. Just to comment, there have in the United States been political constraints on universities that are publicly funded. So it is a women's organization about women in orthopedic surgery, but I think of it like women's study program. Anyone is able to attend. So it is not specifically only for women based on our present political environment, but it's about women, how women can become orthopedic surgeons or underrepresented, as an example of an underrepresented group. So we continue to try to work on the intersectionality of other underrepresented minorities as well. So that's kind of a long scoop on that. Zach, I'd be interested a little bit in your comments. When we wrote this, we kind of thought 25% will probably be, if we can get 25% of the specialty as females, is 30% really the right number? I guess that's one of the modeling things. Like, do we really need 30% to no longer be a minority? Or is 25% sufficient? And you had mentioned that before, Zach. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think more, heading that way is better, and always having the eyes on the prize, the goal to be that. I think that at least looking at the data from outside of orthopedics, I think that's where a lot of those organizations really hung their hat on. So, I mean, ideally, I think you're right, 30% would be good, but I think 25% is probably enough. It depends on, I guess, who are those 25% as well, maybe, and what they can potentially represent or do to the organization. One of the questions that Dr. Weber had to you and was, given that we know orthopedic residency programs with a sustained commitment and a percentage of women in the program, and programs that also have maybe few or no women in their program, both can actually be self-perpetuating. For the ones that have, the latter, the few or no women in their programs, how can we make an impact in some of these programs? What if there is a woman or a woman of color or minority that feels like there's maybe not enough or not others in their program? How can they thrive? What's some advice you would potentially give? And I'll stop there.
Yeah. So it's not part of this particular journal club, but I did write an article on whether gender education occurs on a even basis across the United States, and it does not. There are certain programs in the country that train a lot of women and certain programs in the country that do not. So we started in 2005 tracking this, and at that time, there were 30% of the programs in the country had no women. In our next iteration, looking at 10 years, there were 25%, 15 years, there were 10%, and we're just writing up the most recent one, and it's down to 5% of programs. But on the flip side of that, there are programs that are training most of the women. And this, again, has started to switch. But initially, it was about 30 to 35% of the programs that were training most of the women in the country. So I think Dr. Weber brings up a really great point in that, and that's what I was saying at the beginning of this, the United States has a little bit different barriers than other countries in the world where there are less programs. We have 208 programs across the country, and all of those programs are at a different point, and they have different faculty composition, they have different selection processes, and there certainly are a number of programs where individuals are not supported, and we've seen an attrition of medical students and residents of color and of female gender. So it certainly is something that's well recognized. There is not even distribution of the education across the United States. Certain programs train more and certain programs train less. And so trying to provide greater mentorship to the programs where there aren't natural mentors. And I know the Ruth Jackson Society is working on that, really trying to provide mentorship. And one of the things we've tried to do is provide mentorship across specialties. So maybe you can meet someone in general surgery who has similar interests to yourself, if you're someone in minority, or maybe you can find a female urology resident that you particularly can identify with. And so it doesn't have to be specialty specific. That's another strategy, is looking at other specialties to help support. But I do think that our initiatives, such as the Perry Initiative, really need to focus on programs that do not have the support structure there, at least to spark the interest. And then many of these other programs as well, Nth Dimension and Ruth Jackson and the Gladden Society and the AOLOS. I think these are all organizations that are trying to support institutions that have less representation of residents from underrepresented groups. It's a challenge. Yes.
Thank you, Ann. So we have two more questions that I think we'll try to go through before we conclude. The first one is from Lori Heemstra. She's always doing a good job of trying to keep perspective for us. And so she asks, obviously, these articles, while we tried to have this be a global perspective, especially with the first two articles, there is still a bit of an American bias in all of this, particularly with this article. And so she is asking, do you think that global initiatives with successes or failures in other countries might have different results? She said might influence these data, but I'm interpreting that to mean you think that we would potentially see different results in different contexts.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that many of the countries have come up with programs somewhat like Perry Initiative. And Lori, maybe you can comment, but I believe the Canadians have some workshops that try to interest medical students with hands-on skills so that you can try putting on an external fixator or, rodding a bone or plating a radius. I know that Australia has that. New Zealand has that, I believe. And again, you can comment. I believe Canada has that. So I do think, at least in my travels, I was impressed that a number of different countries have similar initiatives of just trying to attract people into our specialty. And as Arthur pointed out, how can we make our specialty attractive? So I do think there's some commonality across countries.
Maybe to dovetail with that statement, I'll ask the last question for tonight anyway, from Stuart Proper, again about, he basically stated that he has assumed that most people who are involved in this webinar are interested in diversity within orthopedics. So these are engaged people, presumably. How do we engage those who do not wish to be engaged? And I'd be interested in your comments, Ann, but I also think, Dago, Arthur, and Lily, you guys have all had your own journeys. I think it'd be interesting to hear from you as well, if you're open to sharing your thoughts.
I'll kick it off, and then we can maybe go around the panel and each contribute to this question. It's always the catch-22, right? The people who come to the meetings are the people who are interested, and then you're preaching to the choir. So I think we get energized here as a group and then we go out into the world. To me, that's how it disperses. What do you think, Lily?
I think I first want to just share a note about my own experience with the Perry Initiative. I participated in it as an MS1, and it certainly served as that spark for me. I remember asking Dr. Onizuka specifically, do you have to be really strong to be an orthopedic surgeon? And I was really reassured by that answer, and it's just one of those memories for me where I think maybe some other folks may have not had that question necessarily, but for me, that just reassured me, kept me going, and happy to be a resident now. So, in terms of engaging people who don't want to be engaged, I don't really have a good answer for that one. I think for people who are engaged, continuing to be a part of organizations like IODA, like Perry Initiative. I think it's inspiring, and I actually didn't hear about IODA until Dr. Tompkins reached out to me. So this was also new to me, and I think continuing just to be a part of these efforts will help with that.
To answer that question, and again, giving a little bit insight to my own journey, anybody that knows me probably would say that I'm very persistent. And I believe that, as with most things in life, your persistence will win people over. So when you are engaging and you are putting forth that effort to, again, make this the best field and make sure we're taking care of patients to our absolute best, it almost shames other people to action, where they're like, okay, well, yeah, Dr. Tompkins is like, he had a full day of clinic and he is putting on this presentation, or he's meeting with medical students, or Dr. Van Heest, she was in the OR all day and then saw some patients and made calls, but then she's also meeting and planning to go to the next Perry Initiative, and just continuing to be involved. It will spur people to action.
Yeah, and I think bouncing off on that too is having like a purposeful persistence. By that, for example, I was able to go to my first academy thanks to the help of Anthony Dimensions, and from there I was able to meet Dr. Letitia Bradford, who continued to mentor me, and she continued to give me insight into what specific things I could be doing, what specific things and how specifically I can be, organizing my efforts to make myself a better applicant and impress people that maybe traditionally don't look at minority applicants and whatnot, and how to shine, to show that, with our persistence, with our efforts, we are knowledgeable, we are smart enough to be in this field. And I think that's one of the things that I would recommend is, if there are people that aren't interested in this kind of work, try to surround yourself with people who are, and then in that regard, you'll be able to win people over, because, as our field is expanding, some of the current individuals here, they've had to gone through a different route where originally they weren't as welcomed, and so they know how to navigate those difficult roads and can provide insight to us. So that's what I would say.
Just briefly to answer that question, and I appreciate everyone sharing their story. There's a couple of ways that I could think about trying to answer that question. The first is, I think we have to work within the margins. Ones that potentially the opportunities arise where, someone might maybe have some bias or may have a different viewpoint, and shares that. That's an opportunity in my mind to be able to engage with them. And you may not always have those opportunities, but I think those are the ones that can really be meaningful. I think also having a good culture, and reinforcing and defending that culture. I think, people can have implicit or explicit bias. And I think as everyone here is going to be a surgeon or is a surgeon, and it's important to, as a leader of the team, to be able to lead by example. And so one of the things that we're looking at specifically is, when you have to tell people or let them know this is, not right, that's really important. I think some of the challenges is that sometimes in the environmental culture, things can things can happen and no one acknowledges it. But I think that's the most important time to actually speak up and acknowledge certain things. So yeah. Well, Marc, Anne, yeah, thank you so much. I think we're a little over time, but this was a really meaningful journal club. And I think the last thing I was going to say was that I think when we have organizational events like this, where, we can kind of come together, I know maybe, we're all in it for all in it for one another. It really kind of builds upon, fills your soul, builds upon everything, and then you go out in the world and you try to make a difference. So I do appreciate everyone. Thank you so much for attending. And with that, I think we'll conclude.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Arthur and Dago and Lily, for your presentations. And thanks, Marc and Zach, for organizing. Have a great night.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.